In this section of the course, we're moving back into the timeline. So we're following on to Marx and that critique of culture, the Marxist-based materialist critique. And so in this chapter, Douglas Mann is referring to, he's organizing it as he does throughout the book into questions. And so his question for this section is, what's wrong with modern industrial society and the consumer culture it gave birth to? Now, we've already been talking about that, and many of you have been talking about that in the posts, and I think we've been having a really, really good conversation about this. I can see you're thinking about it. So, as I said at the very beginning, that is my hope, that you can take these theories and look at the world around you. So he gives one of his little snapshots of sort of contemporary people living this kind of critical theory in their political life. And then he turns to the philosophical foundations of this. And so this is what I'm going to be talking about here. I'm going to be focusing on psychology for this lecture, and I'm going to be adding in some material that has been left out, in my opinion. In looking at the context for the thought of some of the people that we'll be examining as we move through this section, we need to look at Friedrich Nietzsche, and many of you will have heard of him or studied him in your other classes. And he's one of the most famous philosophers of the modern era. And if any of you are my students from before, you'll know I have my issues with Nietzsche, so I can talk about that as we go here. But just to give some background, he was born in Prussia, so what's now Germany. His father was a pastor, and we're going to see a little bit of a pattern here. We look at Durkheim, long lineage of rabbis, Nietzsche, religious clergy in his family. And we are in the psychology section, so we can start talking about father complexes and mother complexes, I guess. But I'm not going to speculate too much here. And so he was seen as a prodigy, clearly a brilliant person intellectually, and held a number of academic posts throughout his life, but he also had ill health throughout his life. And so there's a lot of controversy swirling around Nietzsche about what was causing his ill health. He ended up dying in a mental asylum. So there's many theories about what caused his illness. He seems to have probably had syphilis, which may have contributed to it. So his fame is based on a number of his very important writings that I'll be looking at. But he is certainly a polarizing figure, and we'll get into that. Despite my own misgivings, there's no way around it. We have to look at Nietzsche because he's important. Whether you agree with him or not, his ideas have been very influential. They've influenced people like Michel Foucault, many, many philosophers that follow after him, and psychologists that follow. And so we need to engage it. Now, there's a whole collection that refers to him as the godfather of fascism. And again, we're getting into just controversy swirling around him. And so many people have argued that this was not his ideas. This was his sister, who married into a family that ended up developing into kind of the Nazi movement. Well, you can make your own decisions about this, but certainly this has been a charge leveled at him, and I think when we look at his ideas, you can see why he appealed to members of the Nazi movement. So he famously stated that God was dead. So this is his most famous saying, and certainly when I'm teaching my Intro to Religion, I have to look at Nietzsche because I do a whole section on atheism and the development of atheism in the 19th century, and he's probably the number one person to look at. So he, through his writings, some of you may have read him. It's feverish would be one way of describing the writing. It's often difficult to get at what he's actually saying, and this is part of the reason for the controversy, because it's not clear. And so he stated that God was dead. And again, we have to be careful here. It's a very obviously provocative statement. But his idea was that the Enlightenment and reason and science had basically done away with the power of religion, and many people have made that argument. So his basic position was, so what now if religion doesn't have this power? So we've already seen that Durkheim and Weber were also very concerned with this. They took very different paths when they looked at it. Durkheim definitely was concerned with the vacuum left by the power of religion and its ability to prevent anomie, as we've been discussing in this course. And so, but for Nietzsche, his is more of a triumphalist. This is a freeing thing to be free of religion, and so he argued that Christianity was the religion of slaves and created a slave mentality. And I've always found this sort of darkly amusing because Christianity was a religion of the slaves. It was one of the reasons why Christianity was so popular in the Roman Empire was because of its teachings that all human beings were equal, and this logically went against the whole idea of slavery and empowered slaves to question the institution, and it did even into if we look at the 1800s, many of the abolitionists were Christians. So yes, it was the religion of slaves. That's true. But of course, Nietzsche is not looking at this in a positive way. He's looking at this as a kind of this servant mentality. He's looking at humility in a very negative way. That this is a kind of brainwashing. So a bit like Marx here, that Christianity is a kind of brainwashing that stops us from achieving our full potential. And I discuss this much more in my religion class. That this is highly problematic. But anyway. So he develops the idea of the Übermensch and the will to power. And this is where the connections with fascism, you can see them pretty easily. So if we reject this slave mentality that he's talking about and concern with morals and, the well-being of others and so on, we can then become the Übermensch. Now, this is not talking about women. And this has been often said about fascism. Guillermo del Toro, the great Mexican director, said fascism is a boys' game. So he's not talking about superwomen. He is not. So the idea that the real man, the Superman, overcomes these limitations that religion has placed upon him to, care for others, have compassion, and so on, and then can become excellent. So he's basically saying all these weak, sniveling people are holding back the Übermensch, the great person. And so I was presenting this in a class years ago, and one of my students very quickly said, "Isn't this a sociopath?" And I was like, yes, it is. So this is my problem with it. Now, I know many, many people who defend Nietzsche, so I leave that to them. Some of you may have taken philosophy courses where he's handled with more sympathy. I think these ideas are deeply disturbing, personally. So this idea of overthrowing all of these ideas of morality, right? So if we follow it logically, he seems to be arguing that each person should create their own morality. Now, I'm hoping you can see the difficulty with this, because first of all, how would we do that? How would an individual go about doing that? And morality and law are fundamentally social. So if we had every single person with their own morality, how would you function as a society? So laws, for instance, are based on morality, essentially. So these would be unenforceable. So to me, logically, this is anarchism and nihilism. So it's just each individual out for themselves. And I've often made this argument about anarchy, that when you get into a state of anarchy, the person that rises to the top is the demagogue, right? Is the kind of fascist dictator, because they impose order. And that's often very appealing to people that are in a state of chaos. So very, very dubious to me. So his idea is that the true man, the real Übermensch, uses the will to power. And so for Nietzsche, this is all there is our personal will to power that we then can use to develop our lives. So I can see on one level, this is saying, there's a lot of agency within the individual. And I think this is appealing to people, and you build your own life. So obviously that's great. But if we follow the other ideas logically, we're heading into choppy water. So he wrote the influential The Genealogy of Morals, and this has influenced many, many thinkers into the present. It was published first in 1887. And so again, the subtitle is a polemic. So I think I talked about polemic as a form. So pretty much Nietzsche is all about the polemic. So this kind of overwrought critique of society. So he's moving into the vacuum that the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution is creating. We're seeing all of these thinkers responding to those larger forces. And I was very happy to see in your papers, you were all taking that on board, that these forces had created a lot of instability, certainly in European society. And Nietzsche also develops the idea of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. So you see, again, he's doing this leaping over Christianity or any form of religion, sort of going back to the classical period. And so he develops this idea of Apollonian and Dionysian society. I do find this an interesting idea. So the idea that the Apollonian is the very controlled, rule-bound approach, and the Dionysian is the creative, that he's the god of intoxication and so on. So his ideas have been extremely influential. As I said, you can't avoid him, but I just really need to, from my point of view, look at where this can lead if we follow it logically. We're now going to turn to the thought of Sigmund Freud. I'm sure you've all heard of Sigmund Freud. He's considered to be one of the founders of contemporary psychology, and if anybody has studied psychology, I'm sure you have looked at his work. And he was born in what was the Austrian Empire, and this is also very important to note that the nation states that we're familiar with right now did not exist in the same way. So he was born into what would now be called the Czech Republic. So you can sort of chart the turmoil through the way these names have changed, because that area then, there's the Second World War, and it came under communist control, and then it broke apart. So very turbulent right from the time of his life. So, and he definitely got caught up in that, and I'll talk about that. But so he was born in what is now the Czech Republic. His family moved to what is now Austria, so Vienna, which was a cultural center, and it became really the hub for this emerging field of psychology. So if you were interested in this, you would go to Vienna and meet the great man. So he starts out in medicine and starts working with people who are dealing with things like what were then called hysteria. So many of you will know the controversy around hysteria. But so we see right in the beginning this tension between the humanities and science. So the idea that is psychology a science or humanities? And I often ask my students this, because I often have psychology students in my courses. So for instance, in Nipissing, is psychology a science or humanities? Apparently the answer is both. But certainly there has been a drive to make it a science, just as we've talked about this with sociology. So that's an ongoing tension that exists. And Freud was very much wanting the discipline to have the respect of science. We've talked a lot about that in this course, that wanting that kind of imprimatur of science so that people take it seriously. And this was one of the reasons for the split with Jung that I'll talk about. So Freud, just a towering figure within psychology. Now, many of his theories have been critiqued. So one of the main critiques, and I agree with this, is that many of his theories are very based in his culture, and he's universalizing it. So he talks a lot about father complexes and the father, which is clearly mapped onto the European kind of authoritarian patriarchal father, which doesn't necessarily exist in all cultures. And his ideas about religion also stem from this, as though God is just the Father writ large. That could be true in certain forms of Judaism and Christianity, but is not true for Hinduism, for instance, where there's just a plethora of goddesses. So again, this idea that this is universal, people have come to question, but nonetheless, these theories have remained very influential and continue to be into the present. So I want to look at Freud's theory of the human mind, and obviously this is just scratching the surface. You could do courses on this, and there are courses on this. And so as I said, he's a central figure in the development of psychology, and he attracts to him all of these just amazing thinkers. And we're going to see that also at the Frankfurt School. So to my knowledge, this doesn't happen as much anymore, but this was definitely happening at the time. Maybe it has to do with just the instability in the culture at the time, but where these schools were forming and great thinkers were attracting other great thinkers and so on. So he develops the idea of the unconscious mind. It's not to say he's the only person who developed this. The Romantics had already kind of worked on this, but he fleshes it out and writes about it. So this is the concept that we're not just our rational mind that we deal with day to day. And I just take this as a given, but over the years, I've consistently met people who don't believe in this, so which I just find fascinating. So clearly there are still people who think we're just our rational mind and everything we do is rational. So this relates to the rational choice people that I'm always like, really? Have you observed human behavior? Does it seem rational to you? So this is the idea of the unconscious mind. Now, the different psychologists develop it differently. Of course, I can't get into this too much, but from the Freudian point of view, the unconscious mind is where a lot of our repressions go. So thoughts we won't allow ourselves to think. And I think if you just spend even a few moments reflecting, you'll know that all of us do this all the time, that we're seeing certain things, we put it to the back of our mind because it may cause us to question what we're doing. It may cause us to question a relationship. So repression is a mechanism that he develops that I think is convincing to most people. I don't know, but this idea that there are things that are kind of in the back of our mind all the time. And so from a Freudian point of view, and this is where I think he goes off the rails, everything is sexual. So as I say below, he develops this idea of the libido, which is fine, the sex drive, but he makes it, in his sort of theory, it's absolutely at the center of everything. And you can see the way that American culture really took up Freud, that this kind of underlying belief that if we get rid of this repression on the sex drive, that somehow something magical is going to happen and everything's going to be great. This is very much kind of underneath the sexual revolution and the hippie movement. And I think there are still people that believe that. We need to see this within its time period, which was that he was living in a very repressed Victorian period. So it makes a kind of sense. It doesn't make a lot of sense in our culture, where it seems like there's very little repression as far as I can see. But certainly at the time, I can see how he came to this, that this repression was problematic. So his idea of the unconscious, some people have called it sort of the dumping ground of all these, longings and wishes that we won't acknowledge in our kind of waking mind. So he divided the self into ego, superego, and id, and many psychologists have developed on this idea. I think it's a useful framework. I think people still use it to some extent, even if it's just in a kind of pop cultural way. But the idea of the ego as kind of the mediator between the unconscious and the id and the superego. So the ego sort of sits within what he calls the reality principle. So this is the part of the self that's like, I have essays due, I have to plan for them, I have to plan out my life, I have to do these things kind of realistically. So we all have that or we wouldn't survive. So this is what allows us to see things clearly and to function. But Freud takes this a step much further, saying this isn't the only part of the mind. And some people have a stronger ego than others. And so there's the superego. So from the Freudian point of view, the superego is the contents. It's sort of like your parent in your head, right? So Often this is seen as negative, so all of this repression, but this other thinkers have also said this is also the voice in your head that says don't run out into traffic, right? This is like your mother or father's voice in your head. So this is also the idea of the rules and safety and security that stops you from doing impulsive things. So actually, I would argue superego is very important. But certainly, if it's too strong, I'm really simplifying here, but the idea of, I think we all know these people and we've all experienced this, where the superego almost becomes overpowering, where you're paralyzed. It's a kind of perfectionism of proper conduct, virtue, and so on. So religion can play into the superego here, so with rules and values and morals. And again, that's why I say for me it's not all negative, but certainly it can be too powerful in the life of a person. And then the id, from his point of view, is just the instinctive, emotional self, and so that can lead to impulse. So the ego and the superego kind of take control of the id and control it. So you'll hear people use this just in conversation. They'll say, so and so is pure id, so the kind of person that's always just following their impulses, right? And obviously, that's not always terrible, but certainly a life of just following your impulses, I think we know that's a problem. So he develops this threefold structure of the self. So again, many people would reject this and just say, I think clearly I'm just my rational mind, but he does not accept that. He says it's more complex than that. So there's this kind of tension within the psyche. So he considered dreams to be the royal road to the unconscious mind. So he's one of the first. We have to be careful here that dreams are important, certainly within religious traditions, and I have taught a lot on this, that dreams are actually really, really important in the world's religions. But certainly in Enlightenment, following on the Enlightenment, they're completely dismissed along with religion. And so he brings it back into kind of mainstream discourse, the idea that dreams can be meaningful. And so he calls them the royal road to the unconscious. So the fact that we're mostly unable to access our unconscious mind, that's what it is to be unconscious. But the dreams will allow us to see what's going on in there. Now, from a Freudian point of view, as I understand it, this is often very negative. I don't follow that. I'm more would follow with Jung, who I'll be talking about a little bit later. But definitely they both agree that this is one of the key ways you can get at your unconscious mind. There are other ways. So you probably will have heard of the idea of the Freudian slip, right? This is very much where you meant to say one thing, but something else comes out, but it reveals your true inner thoughts, right? So I'll just give an example from real life. So someone I know, her cousin was getting married for the second time, and you may already see where I'm going with this. So at the time of the toast, after the wedding ceremony, he raised his glass to his bride and used the name of his first wife. So there's a Freudian slip. And so my friend said we all knew the marriage was doomed right at that moment. So there's many versions of this. Another version can be if you get a song stuck in your head, and if you look at the words, they might have meaning for what you're thinking about or what's bothering you. So it's these continue to be very influential ideas, I think, because they make sense to people. And when we get to his ideas about religion, he's definitely, I always teach him on my section on atheism. He's been very influential in kind of the atheist movement. So he considers religion to be a form of neurosis. So it's something that you need to work through in analysis. And so, again, that this is a kind of a delusion. So he shares this idea with Marx, right, that this is a delusion, but his take on it is a little bit different. He sees it, as I said, as a kind of father figure that people want to maintain, and that when they become fully adult, they will do away with it. So this is an atheistic form of psychology. So as I said, he developed the idea of the libido, and he puts it front stage center, which leads to conflict with some other thinkers who think it's important, but it's not the only drive within human beings. And then seeing the First World War, again, like many of the other thinkers we've looked at so far, he lives through the First World War, which is a watershed for Western civilization, which causes it to question itself as a civilization if we were capable of this kind of destruction. And so he develops the idea of the death drive, or thanatos, the idea that not only is there a desire to live, there's a desire to destroy the self, which is obviously, as I said, coming out of what he was observing around him in his own culture. The image I am showing here is of Freud's office, which is reconstructed at the Freud Museum in London, England. And there's also a Freud Museum in Vienna. And the reason so many of the objects related to Freud are in London is because he had to flee Vienna at the time of the annexation of Austria to Germany. So this is it's quite a crazy story from what I have read. It's very sad. Freud was refusing to leave Vienna. He considered himself Austrian, and he was very attached to the kind of intellectual heritage of German culture, though he was Jewish, obviously, but he considered himself, an Austrian. And so he was kind of in denial about what was happening. And so the story goes that one of his key followers, Ernest Jones, went and got his family out, just as literally the Nazis were kind of coming into his apartment. So he moves to London, where he lives out the rest of his life, and his daughter becomes a very influential Freudian, Anna Freud. And his family continues to be very well known in England, and so one of his descendants is a very famous painter, another one is a writer. So some real tragedy here, but his thought obviously survives, and Vienna now has a museum dedicated to him as well. And so this image is of his office, and I always think of this as like the Platonic ideal of an office. Like, wouldn't everybody love this? Just beautiful. And so you can see, this is my argument, that this is not medical in the sense that we would, with a sterile office and the white walls and all of that. It's a very warm, inviting office. So this relates to his development of talk therapy. So in psychology, there still continues to be a very important practice of talk therapy. And so, it can come in many forms, but in the Freudian version, I have not undergone Freudian analysis, but my understanding of it is that you lie on the couch. And so many people will have this in their head, that this is what you do, you lie on the couch. Now, obviously, many psychologists don't do this. You would sit in a chair. But he wanted you to get into your unconscious mind. So he felt that lying down, which is interesting because it almost harks back to the ancient Greeks, the Asclepions, where you would lie on a couch. It's interesting. So you lie back on this beautiful couch, and part of what Freud would do was what is called free association. So he would have the person kind of talk about their dream and then free associate from the dream to different ideas. Now, this is where I often part with Freudianism, because whenever I hear about how they interpret dreams, it's always like everything's a phallus, like everything. So this takes us back to his kind of monomania about the libido. That's not how traditional dream interpretation would work, that everything's a phallus. So I think that tells us more about his preoccupations than about other people. But nonetheless, this model of talk therapy becomes very powerful, and it is taken up by others into the present. Again, not necessarily lying down, that would be very unusual, but this idea of that speaking out these ideas is in itself healing becomes a very important part of contemporary psychological practice. And I would argue that even just the attention to the setting that you're doing it in also influences a lot of people. We all wish to have an office like this, I think, many of us. As I said, Freud attracted many, many great thinkers to him. It's absolutely remarkable how many of the people around him went on to have these very influential careers. So they would hold these congresses. This one's the Weimar Congress in 1911. And so these are some of his closest, I think you could use the word disciples, and you'll see, or acolytes, you'll see why I might say that. In some ways, he is a charismatic leader. There's absolutely no doubt about it. This kind of prophetic, charismatic leader, if we want to use Weberian language. And so you can see there are women there, so it's not all just men in his case. Many women are attracted to this field and continue to be. And so within this photo, we find there's many people here, but Alfred Adler, who many of you also will have heard of, one of the most famous psychologists ever, and also Jewish, also had to flee. And he developed, for instance, the idea of the importance of birth order, which is, I find this to be just so accurate. So he developed the idea that eldest children, middle children, youngest children have different personality structures. This isn't the only thing, but this has been one of the ones that's been most influential. Just to give you an example, another person in the group is Wilhelm Reich, who's also develops very, very interesting theories, also had to flee, also Jewish. So we can see this, at least prior to World War I, this is a very coherent group. Now, there are many stories about this group, and Cronenberg, the Canadian director Cronenberg, tried to make a movie about this, and I don't think he has the sense of the absurd that's necessary to look at this material. But so, as I said, Freud took on this kind of prophetic, very authoritarian, I would argue, role within this group. And he particularly wanted to have this tight group of followers. And so I checked it out because I had heard it, and I checked it out before the lecture to make sure it was true. I don't want to spread false information, even though it's so good it has to be true. He would give out rings to his closest students. And there's actually a collection of them in Israel of these. They're very beautiful if you want to look them up. And they're all very individual, and they often have classical figures on them. And really interesting, right? So clearly this is going beyond science when you're giving out rings to your followers. And he's sort of sending them out into the world. It's very biblical on some level here. And so... and unconscious, I would argue. So one of his key disciples is Carl Jung, and I'm going to look at him separately. And he turns to Jung, partly because Jung is absolutely brilliant in his own right, but also Jung is a Gentile. So Freud is very aware of the anti-Semitism in Europe, and so his hope is that he can kind of pass the torch to Carl Jung, who's a Gentile, and that it can become a mainstream practice. His understanding of psychoanalysis can become mainstream. But there's a spanner in the works because Jung has his own ideas. And so there's a real father-son dynamic here, there's no doubt. So they're kind of living out their own theories. And there's a famous story that Jung and Freud go to the United States to give a series of lectures. And during the trip, Freud becomes convinced that Jung is wishing him dead. And so they're getting into all these conflicts. And eventually he believes that Jung has these repressed urges for his destruction. I don't know if he's basing it on dreams, on Jung's dreams, or I'm not sure. There are many, many reasons why these two break apart, and I can look at that more when we get to the next section. But certainly it's very dramatic, and there's stories that Freud is so upset he faints in a hotel and so on. But eventually this leads to the break with Jung, and so Jung goes on to create his own school of thought. When we come to Carl Jung, we come to another fascinating figure. And as I was saying, he makes this break with Freud, and it actually causes him to he's very open about this, that he has a kind of mental breakdown as a result of the break with Freud, because both of them thought that he would kind of take up this school of thought. So there's a very dramatic story where he's He writes that his great breakthroughs come through this period where he's almost in a psychotic state. So Jung is very open to the idea of the unconscious as a positive, creative force rather than just something to be feared that's this sort of, basement full of all of these repressed ideas. So he has a much more positive view of the unconscious, but we'll get to that. So he is born in Switzerland. He lives his whole life in Switzerland, and his primary school is based there. Although there are schools of Jungian thought all around the world, including in Toronto. And so he is the son of a pastor. As I said, we're seeing a pattern here. And he has a very conflicted relationship with religion throughout his life. We find out later this is all part of the drama around these people. A lot of his work was actually kept sealed until very recently, and just recently, a few years ago, it was opened up by his family. It was sealed for X number of years. So it's called the Red Book is released. And so this apparently contains a lot more of his kind of mystical writing. So like Freud, he was very concerned that he would be perceived more in a religious way and that people wouldn't take his ideas seriously. And I think that's true. Certainly when I was in grad school, you couldn't utter his name. I was always, when we were studying Freud, I was like, why aren't we studying Jung? No, you're not allowed to talk about Jung. I don't know if that's changed, but he's definitely, which seems strange in a religious studies department, but there you go. So he remains a very kind of controversial figure, but he's had a lot of influence within popular culture that I will get to. So he's born in Switzerland. We also find out later that his mother was a spirit medium. So he's coming to it, and he did a lot of studies around spirit mediumship. So we find out later, quite open to these other aspects. And this was clearly one of the reasons that Freud was uncomfortable. So I believe Freud called it the muck of the occult. He was rejecting it, whereas Jung clearly did not. He didn't necessarily write about it because he knew it would be viewed in a certain way. So Jung goes on to become, he studies medicine, he becomes a psychiatrist, and he works in medical clinics in his early life, and then he sort of forges his own path after this breakdown that he has and develops his own ideas about theories of the mind and the subconscious and human potential. So the overriding idea of Jung is much more optimistic about the human psyche and human potential. From what I have read anyway, Freud is just happy if you're kind of without neurosis. But Jung develops this idea of what he calls individuation, that everybody's on a journey to individuate and to become their fullest self, and that we can use our dreams and so on to develop ourselves. So it's a very optimistic way of looking at the human psyche and humanity. While Jung makes that break with Freud, he doesn't reject all of his ideas, and he's actually very positive towards Freud in his writing. I think it's just, again, I think there's that father-son dynamic there with the two of them. So Jung had extreme admiration for Freud, but he had to sort of strike out on his own to develop his own ideas. So he builds on Freud's idea of the unconscious. He has a differing view of it, as I said, that it can be repressed ideas, but it isn't just that. So Jung's ideas resonate much more with kind of religion and spiritual ideas. He develops the idea of what he calls the self, which really seems to be similar to the idea of a religious idea of the soul. And so this idea that you're developing this self throughout your life, and you're constantly, if you're working with it, you're improving and becoming your fullest self. So he makes dream work a central part of Jungian analysis and is open to religious and spiritual ideas. And so, for instance, Jung wrote a whole work or had a whole seminar on Kundalini yoga. So he was reading texts from China, he was reading texts from India and the Hindu tradition. So he had a very rich, taking from classical Greece. He was looking at all of these sources of knowledge, and he had a lot of languages, so he was able to read in Latin and Greek. And so he develops the idea of the archetype. So this may be familiar to some of you. So this idea of, so for instance, he argues that these archetypes exist, such as the archetype of the mother. So that is archetypal for all human beings. Everybody has a mother. And so this will occur, for instance, in dreams, the dreams of the mother. The archetype of the hero. So some of you may have heard of the idea of the hero's journey, that this is archetypal in all cultures. And this would be why, for instance, you can show a movie about a hero in any culture and everybody's going to understand it. So his argument is this is just part of it. It's like grammar that exists within the mind. It's just part of our makeup as human beings, our psyche. And so I didn't talk about transference and countertransference in the Freud section, but he develops also Freud's idea of transference. Some of you may have heard of this, the idea that when the person is in analysis, they will start to project, for instance, their mother or father on the analyst, or they may fall in love with the analyst. And so this is recognized as just something that people do, and you need to work through that. And many schools of psychology talk about, first of all, the importance of what they call the therapeutic alliance, the relationship between the psychologist and the person that they're working with. So Jung accepts this and develops on it, this concept of you have to work with that. And so he also develops the idea of personality types. And so we use these typologies all the time, not knowing it comes from Jung, but the idea of the introvert and the extrovert. And I'm always amazed by those people who are like, oh, I'm both, I'm the best of all worlds. From a Jungian point of view, that can't happen. You're one or the other. Now, there's a spectrum. Some people are much more introverted than others, but nonetheless, there's a difference. And so the way that it's best been explained to me, that makes sense to me, is that, so you can think about this in terms of your own life. So introverts will tell you they're drained by most social interactions. Like, for instance, making small talk is like punishment to an introvert. So whereas an extrovert will just happily chat. I always use the example of someone I used to know. He could go out every night of the week and socialize all night long and just be fine. Whereas an introvert, that would be completely exhausting. So that's the easiest way to tell the difference. It's not that introverts dislike people. It's that they need to spend time alone to kind of recharge. So anyway, you can look into this if this interests you, but this is one of the ideas he develops. And then this goes on to be developed into the Myers-Briggs and some of these other personality questionnaires. Now, some of you may have done this. I highly recommend it. It's really interesting. And I know some employers use the Myers-Briggs. I have found it to be really accurate because the Myers-Briggs or the Keirsey sorter, be careful because they always want your email. My nephew had a way he had like a fake email you could send it to. I'm sure you're computer savvy. You can do it so that you don't end up getting emails from these people. But so the Myers-Briggs or the Keirsey, they use the introvert extrovert, but they also include Jung's idea of thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, that these are the primary ways of functioning in the world. And so you could be introverted with primary thinking and so on. So there can be a mixture of all these things. So when you answer the questionnaire, it decides this for you. And so there's actually a YouTube comedian that does a whole series about, maybe I'll attach one of the different types. It's very funny. So the idea being, from the point of view of employment, that you can figure out what you want to do for a living. And it's interesting. I've found it to be very, very accurate. And I think it's helpful because I have always said there are certain things people can do. They can do it, but they're not going to enjoy it, right? So, for instance, an introvert is probably not going to enjoy a job where they're dealing with the public all the time. That's not always true. So for instance, I've known cases where an extrovert could do computer science but hates it because they're always in a room alone, right? So anyway, I leave it with you. If you do it, please post on your findings if you thought it was accurate. But I do think it's helpful because I think a lot of young people they're like I really don't have a good solid sense of what I'd be good at and what I'd enjoy doing. So it can be helpful. I'm not saying it's a crystal ball that's going to give you all the answers, but I think it's stuck around because it actually does help people. Um, so his ideas have been popularized by people like Joseph Campbell. So he wrote a book called, very famous book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, beloved of hippies everywhere and kind of new age spirituality. And it was actually taken up by the creators of the Star Wars theory and developed into Star Wars. So you can see a lot of the theories of the hero developed into popular culture. What you may be hearing is the sound of my neighbor knocking down giant icicles from his roof. And this is what we have to deal with during a long Canadian winter when you're working from home. So I just wanted to end by talking about dream analysis, which is central to Jungian practice. And so, as with Freud's ideas, they're theories, but they're also practice in psychological practice through a form of talk therapy. And as I think I mentioned, Jungian practices only continue to grow. So, for instance, they're opening up schools in places like China. Although I suspect many of you are not familiar with this. I could be wrong there. And as I stated, there's a training center in Toronto. So with dream analysis, which I am familiar with, you would take your dream into the analyst. So you would write it down. Typically, you write down all your dreams in the morning, and you take it to the analyst, and you read it aloud to the analyst, and then you work with the images in the dream. So as I said, this is a much more positive view of the unconscious, so that it's not only, it can have repressed material, but it's also can be the source of healing from a Jungian perspective, because the dream is telling you the direction your life should be going in and how to become free of things like neurosis and complexes. So part of the training of a Jungian analyst would be, for instance, reading fairy tales, reading myths. So Jungians work a lot with symbolism. So I'm showing you an image of Jung. Also was an artist, and so this is an image of a cross. So the idea of the cross might appear in a dream, and so you would work with what that symbolism means, both kind of universally, but also what that image means to you personally. So you can look at it in a variety of ways and what that symbol is trying to express within your life at that given moment. And so, as I said, Jungians will train in all of these different. So often they'll use symbol books to work with symbols when they're working with people's dreams. So it's a much more intuitive way of doing talk therapy than what we might see with other forms of psychology. So as I said, this has been very influential in pop culture as well. There's been many Jungians that have followed, that have written, being influenced by Jungian ideas. So as I said, Jung himself was also very artistic, and so he would work within his tower. He had a very famous tower that he would work in, and so it's become a pilgrimage site. And someone I know was just there a few weeks ago, going on her pilgrimage to Jung's tower in Switzerland.